We'll take our dinner now and start the program in about 20 minutes.
Thanks, Rick. Thank you, Rick, and thank you, Stacy. While you're starting, let me just do a couple of things. I'm Richard Downey. I'm the president and CEO of the World Affairs Council of Orange County. Relatively new, so we're still getting going. But let me also add my good wishes to Bill Edwards, our chair of the board, who is at home, but we thank you, Bill, we miss you. Let me also thank the members here of our Founders Club. We're doing an annual giving campaign, and the members of our Founders Club are the lead donors for this campaign. You know, they're our angels. And I ask Helen, Judge Gray, and Grace, is Harley here? Fred, are you here? Yes. Fred, would you all please stand? There's a number of others, but would you please join me in thanking our lead donors for this campaign? We've started our annual giving campaign. This is the first ever, and the goal is 175,000, and we're about 100 right now. So thanks to our Founders Club. And by the way, this is, even though we are an organization that's been around for 53 years, the way we are right now is kind of refreshing and restarting. So we could use all the help we could get. So you will find some pledge forms around the table. If you have an opportunity, we would welcome your contributions and donations. We really appreciate all the help you can give us to do the mission that we do, which is to inform our community and promote dialogue on the kind of issues we're going to have tonight with Alan Burson, Greg Burke, and Louis DeCipio, moderated by Rick. So we're looking forward to that. Also, by the way, if you have a chance, there's flyers around for the upcoming events. What we'll have coming up later this month, we hope to have a virtual event on Iran, all the protests that are going on in Iran. On the 3rd of November, we hope to have, I know this is a productive conversations around the table, but if I could get your attention. On the 3rd of November, we're having an event on Brazil, which is should be a very, very nice. How many of you have been to Soka University out in the Aliso Viejo area? It is a beautiful area, and it's about what's going on with the elections in Brazil shortly after the Brazil elections with Bolsonaro versus Lula. So we'll have the former U.S. ambassador to Brazil, Ambassador Chapman there, as well as a Brazilian IMF official, Paulo Nogueira. We'll also have a China expert, Susan Shirk, on the 8th of December, which should be very interesting. We'll be opening that going on soon. The reason I mention this, it's easier if you register now. So if you can, on your way out, we would appreciate it. So much appreciate that. Also, I want to thank, please join me in thanking some of the folks that made this happen. This is the first time we've been at this venue. It seems like a very, very nice place to be. But I want to thank Lindsay and Norblue and Sydney, who helped us to do this. Norblue was our intern, has done some marvelous things. Lindsay and Sydney back in the back there. Sydney you know her for many years, but she has to go on to other things as a full-time student, and so we are losing Sydney as our staffer. But we want to thank you, Sydney, for all you've done. I want to thank Lindsay and Norman. Please join me. But, you know, when a window closes, a door opens. We also have a new staffer coming, Krista Seitz. Krista, are you here? Oh, she's out. Well, She's going to be joining us tonight as well, or she has been joining us tonight. She'll be our new staffer, so we'll have a chance later on. But please enjoy your dinner, and since this is an immigration issue that's going to be talking about the southern border, buen provecho. Enjoy your meal. Thank you.
Yeah.
Served as the Department of Homeland Security Special Representative for Border Affairs under Jan Napolitano, informally known as the Border Czar. Alan later served as Assistant Secretary for the Department of Homeland Security from 2012 until 2017. Alan was raised in New York, went to Harvard College, and then to Oxford as a Rhodes Scholar. In 1974, he received his JD degree from Yale Law School. And while he now lives in Washington, D.C., Alan has California connections. From 1995 through about 2007, he was California Secretary of Education under Schwarzenegger, and prior was a former superintendent of San Diego City Schools, and is a past U.S. Attorney for the U.S. District Court for the Southern District of California. To my immediate left is Professor Louis DeCipio of UC Irvine, and is its chair of and professor of Chicano Latino Studies, School of Social Sciences at UCI. His credentials include PhD 1983, University of Texas at Austin, MA, UT Austin in Latin American Studies, and BA Columbia University in History. He's also president of the Western Political Science Association from 2015 to 2016. Under his UCI bio, I noticed his statement, the question that connects all aspects of my research is how democratic nations, particularly the United States, incorporate new members. And third, but not last at all, Mr. Gregory Burke is a partner in the Labor and Employment Practices Group with global firm Shepherd Mullen here in Irvine. Greg has over 20 years of experience advising on all aspects of immigration matters and assists employers worldwide with the hiring and retention of foreign national executives and highly talented individuals that are needed in their U.S. operations. He is a certified specialist in immigration and nationality law through the State Bar of California's Board of Legal Specialization, and author of Immigration Checklists and Practice Pointers, published by the American Bar Association in 2020 for general counsel and HR managers here in the U.S. Greg holds an MBA from George Washington University and a JD from Western State University College of Law. So please help me welcome our three panelists tonight. Again, let's start with Louis, if I could. Can you give us some perspective on the scope, history, immigration globally? What does that really look like?
Sure. Migration, can everybody hear me? Well, thank you very much for the opportunity to speak and all of you coming out this evening. Migration has always been a part of human reality. We look at sort of the stories that have guided us from the beginning, stories of people moving one place and going to another. This question has become much more rigorous in the period, since nations started forming under particular leaders. So, we come to think of migration more formally now, but we have to recognize that we were always aware of people from elsewhere in our midst. Today, about 3% of the world's population live in a country other than the country where they were born. These numbers are growing slightly. If you think of a global population, this is a lot of people that live somewhere other than where they migrate. Just as migration has always been a part of our reality, the effort to restrict migration has always been part of our reality. And I think we saw some images on the screen of the Great Wall of China, which was originally designed as a tool to keep out less developed people from the more developed areas of China. During the period after World War II, there were walls built to keep people mostly in communist countries. There have been efforts more recently to build a wall along the southern border of the United States. So those restrictionist efforts have always been there, and they've taken less dramatic forms. The panel may not agree on very much, but I think one thing that from a call we had a couple weeks ago that we do agree on is that walls don't work very well. So, nice imagery, not a very practical solution. In the last 20 or 30 years, we have seen an uptick in migration globally. And the United States actually has not been at the core. It's certainly been a part of it. But as the image to your right shows, you see a much higher increase in the rates of immigration going to Asia and Europe than to the United States. This is UN images for what it's worth. So it shows you some raw numbers, but also shows you rates of increase again over the last 30 years or so. With climate change and with increasing health disparities, I think it's quite reasonable to assume that we will see even greater pressures for migration in the coming years. So what we're talking about now is important in the short term, but it's also a question that we need to be thinking about.
Give us a sense of some of the flashpoints generally around the world.
So let me, as Louis did, thank you all. People with civic virtue and civic interest are critical. And I'm thankful for the invitation and happy to be here with Louis and Greg and with all of you. So Louis is right. People are on the move as never before, but there is a political tension that is involved that frankly is highlighted in contemporary times, not only in terms of the people coming across from Africa who are attempting to get to Italy across the Mediterranean and drowning in unprecedented numbers, but what we're more familiar with, which are the flows toward the U.S. border that are coming from, traditionally from Mexico, but no longer now principally from Mexico, and then starting in about 2014 and 15 from Central America, particularly the so-called Northern Triangle countries of El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras. But now, today, the largest number of people coming toward the United States are actually Venezuelans, and again, Cubans, and some Haitians. What we're seeing, though, is a political tension that's attendant to this that actually started here in California now 30 years ago. But let me not jump ahead of the story, Rick. The factors of pushing people out of societies, whether it's war zones, the kind we've seen in Syria and Afghanistan and Ukraine, or whether it's weather events that led people to leave their residences, or whether it's lack of economic opportunity and the search for a better life, which led, I suspect, most of the grandparents and parents and people sitting in this room at some point in American history to actually get up and relocate. This is now happening with a intensity that's new, and therefore with a political tension that's unprecedented. It now seems unfortunately baked into American politics.
So on our southern border, Alan, where's traditionally been the greatest pressure points?
So it started in, back 30 years ago, when the enforcement regime started in Southern California. There were only two places where most of the migrants crossed, because there was no effort to deter them or enforcement. So the large majority of migrants came through the San Diego border from Baja California, or through the Texas border from El Paso. People basically just walked across the Rio Grande in El Paso. Remember, we're now in the 1990s, late 1980s. But they walked across into the city and then blended into the urban life, and then were transported elsewhere into the country. But the numbers were far different in the 1980s and 1990s for reasons we can explore. But Rick, actually what happened was, as the enforcement started to occur in the 1990s in El Paso and San Diego, you started to see a movement of the migration to those places where the Border Patrol wasn't. So you went from San Diego to El Centro to Yuma to Tucson and Nogales, and then coming from the Gulf of Mexico, coming west from the Gulf of Mexico, you saw the same thing going from the Rio Grande Valley toward El Paso. Today, the largest influx of migrants is through the Rio Grande Valley in southeast Texas. That's the place that is now the current hotspot for reasons that I'm happy to talk about. But right now it's so-called origin.
So certainly people are needed there, but Greg, tell us what's the poll going on in immigration in the U.S.?
In terms of
The poll from industry. Why are these people coming here? Where are the opportunities? What's happening that's drawing people to the U.S.?
We do have a tremendous labor shortage in certain areas, particularly in the high technology area and then in the unskilled labor. So, Silicon Valley and a lot of employers in that space have difficulties finding scientists, engineers, software developers. And of course, on the other end, restaurants have difficulty finding dishwashers and busboys, and car washers have difficulty finding workers, and nannies and maids and so on. So we've got a shortage in two spectrums of the market.
And any particular industries? So give us an example of particular industries where your clients, where are the big backlogs?
I deal mostly with employers that are hiring in the technology area, and for that, unfortunately, Congress was well intended, but the majority visa of choice is the H-1B, and that's subject to a quota. And so we're taking the best and brightest and putting them through a quota machine. And so U.S. employers filed 500,000 applications this last March for H-1B workers, and Congress has set a quota of 85,000. So you can see there's a tremendous discrepancy between the demand and the supply. And, you know, Canada and Europe and a lot of Australia, a lot of other countries are going to be beneficiaries.
So give us a sense of what does that process entail? An HP1 visa applicant goes through what?
So first, now there's an electronic lottery that U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services, USCIS, has. In March, by the way, is this too loud? Good. Employers notify attorneys that they want to sponsor somebody for a work visa. Typically, these are people that came here as F1 students. These are the best and brightest from other countries, and they're coming here to get a master's degree in technology and management information systems and data analytics, and they get a 1-year practical training. Sometimes they get a 2-year extension, and then the only thing they can do is an H-1B. And so we put them through the lottery with some electronic information. If they get in, then we have to file a whole petition. There are protections. The Department of Labor has prevailing wage requirements based on the level of skill required. The employers, the filing fees are low. The government filing fees are $5,000. You can go to the U.S. Supreme Court probably for a few hundred. So it's an expensive process.
So how long does that take? When does someone finally find out that
Now, electronically, you find out about a month later, and then you have a 90-day window to file. But I don't think Congress intended that there'd be such a gap between the need for those people and the number of visas allocated under the quota.
Right. What are the other programs today for someone to get in?
You know, immigration is always, as well, very much country specific. If you're Canadian or Mexican, you can avail yourself into the trade NAFTA agreement and certain occupations. And Canadian and Mexican professionals, if their occupation is on the list, it's quite easy to bring them over. There's no quota. We have a free trade agreement with Australia, same thing, and with Singapore and Chile. Otherwise, for professional workers, the H-1B is unfortunately one of the few. There are other non-immigrant visas for like investors and executives and things like that.
And then there's some of the migrant exports programs. So obviously a very disjointed and not working inefficient system. So let's go back to an early slide here, and I want to ask you about, and this was Louis's illustration of sort of periodizing the attempts at making that sort of system work, right? And it's broken today. But give us a little background again on this perspective on, and I want Alan as well to comment about this evolution.
Well, the early history of the United States is one of relatively lax immigration regulation. We all have that sort of mythology of open borders. They weren't really open in the sense that weather was an incredible barrier. Wars in Europe were an incredible barrier. But until the 1860s and 1870s, there was really no immigration regulation as such. There was a naturalization regulation, and that's in the Constitution. The founders thought that was within the powers of the national government. But there wasn't really a thought until the mid-19th century to regulate immigration, freedom of migration. Beginning with pressure in from California, that would be a recurring theme, there was a concern about regulating migration from China. A notion that Chinese labor in this period wasn't free, and would ultimately create a new form of slavery. So it's out of that that the first sort of tentative efforts to regulate immigration, first the quality of the ships, very poor. Very weak regulation. Oh, U.S. flag, somebody else's flag, wanted. But this sort of grows, this pressure to create some regulation grows, and the first sort of dramatic regulation is in 1882 of the Chinese Exclusion Act. Okay. Even there, it was not a regulation called Chinese. It was Chinese coming into the trade. If you were coming, there's a wonderful phrase in the legislation. If you're coming for arts or curiosity, you're welcome. So we Chinese were fine. But that notion that government could regulate immigration creates a new period in the U.S. immigration history where Congress sort of says, boy, we can regulate you, we can regulate here. So we start eliminating socially ostracized groups, polygamists. How you figure that out in order, I'm not quite sure. People who advocate anarchy or socialism. Again, that's sort of hard to regulate unless somebody's stupid or obvious. But anyway, more importantly, the period from the 1880s or 1880s to the 1920s is one where we build a regulatory system so that we can enforce regulation. And this is where you first see the border patrol emerging. On the southern border, to control Chinese immigration. Get to the 1920s, you have World War I, you have fears of an early red scare, you have sort of fears that leads to the most draconian regulations we've ever had. This was the national origin quotas of the early 1920s. There were two laws in that period. It basically tried to freeze the ethnic composition of the country ultimately in what it looked like in 1890. Why 1890? Well, in 1890, the majority of the immigrants were still coming from Northern and Western Europe. The Southern and Eastern Europeans began to come around that period and grew dramatically after. So you freeze the ethnic composition of the country in 1890, you get, one country, if you, I think there was a demographic projection that I love to use with my students, that if you extrapolate from the 1920 census, the United States will be all Italian American in 2000. Obviously, it's the risk, my point in this is the risk of demographic extrapolation. But the national origin quotas freeze that, try to freeze the country in place in the 1890s. The Depression sort of reinforces that. People can't migrate, and the European War in the 1940s, so many don't have much migration. By the 1950s, the U.S. is desperately short of labor. At the high end, we need nuclear physicists to build nuclear weapons. We need rocket scientists. We also need farm laborers and what we now call service sector. So that leads to the most recent final period, if you will, of U.S. immigration history, which begins with the passage of the 1965 Immigration and Nationality Act. This was part of the civil rights ethos of this era, was the notion that the existing laws discriminated and discrimination was wrong. Months after Congress had passed the Voting Rights Act, giving empowerment to African Americans, principal African Americans, empowerment in the South, and the Supreme Court cut that, etc. That's a topic for another reason. The 65 Act enshrines sort of two ideas which U.S. immigration has remained today. One is that nuclear families will want a uniform, and that we should provide a way for recent immigrants to be able to bring in immediate family members. We define that primarily that immigrants do. Nevertheless, the idea that families should be able to unify. The second is that some sectors of the economy will need to recruit abroad. So the 65 Act creates a path for skilled workers, a doctor somewhere abroad, migration is terribly good, but also for labor that organized interests in the society can lobby for. For years, McDonald's was one of the biggest uses of labor certification for young people, for Girl Scouts. So but recognizing that the economy needed to. The third is energy. So that's the reason you have immigration, all that asylum immigration. But it also begins for the first time in American history tells me that some people that they will never appreciate it. They don't have a very family member in the United States, if they don't have what the U.S. economy is looking for. So it creates sort of the root of what we now call undocumented migration, which existed before, unquestionably, but begins to grow in this period. It begins to grow slowly because we don't enforce the borders very much, so people come and go. So you have sort of a steady stream of migrants, but we have a steady stream leaving as well. But as we begin to amp up border enforcement, particularly in the Clinton administration, it becomes more rational for people to stay than to go home, and then we start seeing dramatic growth in what we now think of as undocumented migration. We have a graphic on that I'm sure we'll get to at some point. So, myth of open borders, but greater opportunities to migrate, steadily increasing regulation, and then a civil rights bill that creates opportunities to tell some that they will never be able to come, which creates an incentive to undocumented migration.
So, Lewis is the historian, and but I'm a student of history. So I would say that that's obviously it's a broad characterization, and each of those Lewis would argue with me if I said, most of the European immigration that came was in the late 19th century, the last decade of the 19th century, the first 2 decades of 20th century, when, for example, my grandmother and my other grandparents came over from Russia. So during the period of restriction, we actually saw the Bracero program, which is a massive World War II program of Mexican migrants coming over, farm workers coming over to work in the fields in the Pacific Northwest in Canada. But let's accept this because I want to highlight the point that Lewis made about the Hart-Celler Immigration Act of 1965. That was the fundamental change in the way in which we approached it. Now, I think I differ a little bit with Lewis to say that it's because of who was not included in that led to irregular migration. I think there were many other drivers of irregular migration, for the most part from Mexico. And when we started to see the large impact of Mexican migration, it really came in concert with the North American Free Trade Agreement in 1994. That's when we started to see the numbers go up to levels that we had never seen before, and that's what led to the enforcement. But I also wanted to point out that, remember, we had this 1965 Central Comprehensive Immigration Reform, and then we had a 1986 Act during the Reagan administration. So for the reasons that Greg and Lewis have been talking about, the system gets broken, but it then periodically, generationally would get fixed by a Congress that was functioning. The problem that we have is we haven't had a comprehensive immigration reform now since 1986, and the system is broken in ways that we could explore, but that impact every one of us and everyone who tries to get into the country legally and illegally in ways that we ought to explore. But in terms of enforcement, if you want me to turn to the southern border enforcement, go back to the, Rick, if you would, to the picture of San Diego, Tijuana in 1994. That was the, so I don't take any great credit for being the border czar, the U.S. Attorney in San Diego, or the Commissioner of Customs and Border Protection. But the fact of the matter is, for better or for worse, I've been the Forrest Gump of migration and border management for the last 30 years. Something happens, I turn up. I don't exactly know what I'm doing there, but I learn. This is what was confronted when I arrived as a corporate lawyer from Los Angeles in San Diego in 1993. It was the U.S. Attorney and then the border czar on the southern border. We had, after the The reason NAFTA led to a large increase in Mexican migration was that NAFTA's first effect was to really throw campesinos off their farms in rural Mexico. And they were then pulled by a magnet to the job opportunities in California. But there was a Border Patrol force nationally of 3,000 agents. But go back to that San Diego wreck if you would. That's the way it looked every night. Thousands of people would gather on the Tijuana side, the so-called soccer field, and run across the border. And Border Patrol agents, there were perhaps 40 agents on duty, they would grab 2 migrants, and everyone else would run by. They would take the migrants into the processing center then, which was not a processing center because there was no data techniques. People wouldn't give you, they kept the records on 3x5 cards. People wouldn't give their real names, so that the best identifiers were tattoos and gang markers, and that was the only way in which people were recognized. That began to change because in 1994, because of situations like that, Pete Wilson turned out to be a very good friend of mine in San Diego. So I say this advisedly. Pete Wilson was, in July of 1994, he was behind Kathleen Rice in the gubernatorial race by about 16 points. What grew out of that was the anti-migration campaign and Proposition 187 that actually propelled Pete Wilson to victory in the gubernatorial race in 1994, but also then inserted into American politics the kind of anti-migration bias of a fair number of people and political leaders. So if you go to the one that shows the increase in the number of border patrols, we'll come to the asylum in a minute. No, that's it. So look at the growth. In 1994, largely because of Pete Wilson's, people forget that Pete Wilson rode to the gubernatorial victory on Prop 187 and anti-migrant rhetoric, and that led Bill Clinton to start a border control effort federally. People forget that San Diego was the host of the 1996 Republican presidential convention because Bob Dole, they thought Republicans strategized that they would win the 1996 election in the same way that Wilson had won the 1994 gubernatorial election. Clinton started to ramp up enforcement at the southern border, starting in San Diego and El Paso to a lesser extent. And that was continued through the Obama administration, in fact, through the Trump administration, and you can see that bar graph depicts the increase in the number of Border Patrol agents over the years, from 3,000 to 22,000. And the result was that many more migrants were arrested and apprehended, and the border began to get more and more under control because of the data techniques that permitted biometrics to be taken from the migrants. No more writing on 3x5 cards, so you could identify people who were returned and repeat crossers. But it's been a fluctuating story. Largest peak was in, if you look at 2000, that was the largest number of people that had been encountered at the border, 1.6 million, largely Mexicans. But that's been exceeded this year when more than 2 million people have been encountered into the United States, and in the course of the last 2 years, 1 million people have been paroled or let into the United States. Let me just finish up, Rick, with with the picture of the lineup at, because it's a fundamental point, the lineup in El Paso, where people are lined up. Well, yeah, so what do you think is happening here? This was in after 2016, 17. What do you think? Those are migrants lined up. But what they're doing is not trying to avoid Border Patrol agents. They're actually lined up to find Border Patrol agents so that they can claim asylum. And that's the part of the problem in the contemporary enforcement situation, where people are not sneaking into the United States, aside from single males, sometimes. Most people are coming from Central America, from the Eastern Hemisphere, and they're claiming asylum because the asylum system, which was supposed to rule on asylum petitions within 45 days, actually takes 4.5 years for people to get a hearing on their petition, but they're paroled into the country, and after 150 days, have the right to work in this country. So what we have is a system that is broken, that is being exploited by smugglers and by migrants who, quite understandably, are taking advantage of the hole that exists. But that's why they're lined up there, and you see scenes such as the next one, right? The next that we've seen in repeated towns, such as to the point that during the Obama administration, those were the scenes we saw, people being maintained. The Biden administration has taken a different approach, agree with it or not, which is why should we hold people at all when we don't have a system that can accommodate them? So what basically happens now, you are processed, and then families are permitted into the country, and virtually anyone else, aside from Mexican males, who are still being returned under the public health, the COVID restrictions in Title 42, but you'll have many questions. But that in a thumbnail is the history of enforcement. Began in 1990 and has continued today. But the difference is that we now go, aside from the consensus that existed from Clinton to Obama, we now have diametrically different enforcement approaches that we saw in 2016 from President Trump, which is entirely different than what we're seeing from President Biden. The center has fallen out of the middle, not only of American politics generally, but in terms of the governance of the border and the absence of a consensus about how best to manage it. I will say that we no longer have a border security problem in the United States. What's going on here is a problem of migration management. When you see people lining up to surrender to Border Patrol agents, that's pretty good evidence that we don't have a security problem. And knock on wood, the post 9/11 counterterror protections have served us virtually in a flawless fashion. And I knock on wood again.
Thanks, and you know, it's easy to focus on the negative, and I can go on all evening on the negative. Just to point out that the legacy of the 65 system is about 1 million legal immigrants every year, which is a pretty remarkable number if you think about it, because this has been going, we've been at or above 1 million for over 20 years. It dipped a little during COVID. And of those, about 2/3, there's a lag because it takes 5 years for naturalization, eligibility, about 2/3 naturalized. So the principle of 65, which was to create a path, for some at least, for legal immigration remains, and that system has been remarkably untarred by terror, by folks that have not succeeded economically, which is certainly always the fear. So we have to focus on what's not working, and I think that's our conversation. We shouldn't lose sight of what is working, and that's the legal immigration system, which arguably should be increased, but has given a lot to this country over time.
Louis, wouldn't you say that one of the basic problems that we have, that Greg had alluded to, is we don't have the legal pathways that we need to actually either supply the labor market or to deal with the issues that the country has to confront.
Certainly agree, it needs to be reformed, and, you know, I think we all support some sort of comprehensive immigration reform. But again, not to lose sight of the fact that the nation grows by about 3% every decade due to legal immigration, and those are immigrants that are contributing throughout the economy. So we shouldn't forget the good in the face of what isn't working.
This country was built by immigrants. I mean, we all, aside from original Native Americans, are products of immigrants.
And no other country, even if you calibrate by size of the domestic population, has accepted as many immigrants to legal permanent residence, you know, the opportunity to become citizens, as the United States has, you know, whether you look at the last 30 years or you look over its history. Why is that? Well, we're labor short relative to other parts of the world. We have many, many fewer people per whatever your measure is, square kilometer, than do our European competitors. Obviously, Australia and New Zealand are in worse shape than we are. You know, so anyway, I didn't want to get too deeply into what's not working without looking at what I believe is a success.
Yeah, as we started this conversation, these gentlemen constantly mentioned to me that I shouldn't be referring to this whole thing as a problem, right? But it's truly an opportunity for us in the country that many other countries don't have. Greg, you know, Louis is saying that the system's working, right? A million people a year, but you guys are experiencing something different, right? As you try to make things happen.
Sure, the 1965 was a long time ago, and a lot of things have changed, and the markets have changed, and one of the things I got out of talking to Alan and Louis and preparing for this is, you know, we're not the only country in the world that has to decide who are we going to let in, how many are we going to let in, and when. It's regulation immigration is something that every country has to deal with. As Alan, as you said, the border is not a problem that you can solve in one day. We will always have migration issues, and we have to decide as a country how we're going to deal with them. And the same thing when it comes to non-immigrant visas. How many people are we going to bring in on guest worker programs? How many on the low end of the labor market and on the high end? These are just all decisions that have to be made, and unfortunately it's so politically charged that Congress has not been able to reach a consensus.
So let me go to a few audience questions, and then we'll come back to sort of good policy for us and try to wrap things up. This is one that I think is appropriate. Do both Republicans and Democrats have reasons not to do comprehensive legislation on immigration?
Yeah, for completely different reasons. Although it is a very interesting point for that question to be raised, because it's interesting. You say now, if the asylum system is as broken as we pretended it is, how come the Trump administration, when it controlled Congress and the White House in 2016 to 2018, why didn't it reform, why wasn't there reform legislation put in? And the same question could be asked of the Biden administration. Now, Louis correctly points out that we have, so in effect, neither Trump nor Biden, when they controlled the Congress and the White House, actually introduced a comprehensive reform of the asylum system, put aside everything else for the minute. Now, Louis points out correctly that there are filibuster rules in the Senate that make it more difficult. But where there's a will, there is a way. But neither wanted to do it, and it raises this issue that why did the Republicans not reform? And the answer that I've come up with, frankly, I've tried to figure that one out myself, is that they weren't interested in reforming the asylum system. Stephen Miller just wanted to stop migration, period. This was not about fixing this part of the system or that part of it. And on the contrary side, on the Democratic side, people are not particularly disturbed by the fact that 2 million people have been let into the country to wait for asylum hearings that are 4.5 years in the future. For me, this neither answer is an acceptable one, but I think that's the answer to the question.
What I hear is that for both parties, it's a more effective bludgeoning tool against the other than it is in their interest to solve it.
Yes, that is true, and the solution requires compromise. Republicans would have to give up some things that they hold dear, Democrats would have to give up some things that they hold dear. And this isn't an era where we're seeing a great deal of compromise on big issues. So I think for Democrats, some piece of the legislation has to be a legalization program for some significant share of the 10 or 11 million undocumented immigrants resident in the United States. That's a non-starter for Republicans. That means to get a primary. For Republicans, a key element is an expanded guest worker program, perhaps with some mobility across labor sectors. Democrats, and particularly the union-supported sector of the Democratic Party, is very sensitive about that. For all of us who are sort of vaguely civil libertarians, whether right or left, probably a key part of a compromise bill is a national ID card, which you can imagine what that does to the Trumpist right, but the left isn't very happy about that idea either. So this requires sort of a dramatic change in thinking, or you go for small pieces of reform. That's a possibility, but I think each side is concerned about the little bit of this and a little bit of that model because they think they'll never get what they really care about. I would say the Republicans are a slightly bigger problem, and this may show my own partisan biases, only because they fear getting primary in a way that you don't see from the Democrats. And maybe that's because Democrats are districted in more strongly Democratic districts, so they don't have to worry about it as much. But the second-ranking Republican in the House said something in passing about being open to a DACA-like program. He got primary by an underfunded economist, even worse, an academic. And he was big. And that just went through the House that night. That, oh my God, the second most powerful Republican in the House is losing over immigration. So it would take either a super majority of one party or the other. It doesn't seem like we're going to get that in the short term, or dramatic leadership, and we're not getting that.
Sorry, you mentioned verification, and I just wanted to comment, as was mentioned, the last comprehensive immigration reform we had is 1986, and Ronald Reagan signed that bill. And it was a quid pro quo. It was, we're going to legalize 3 million undocumented workers, and we are forever going to solve illegal immigration because we're going to create verification at the time of employment. And the legacy INS was charged with creating that I-9 form. So all of us who have been hired by employers know we brought our US passport or our driver's license and social or a green card or work permit, and we proved that we were legally able to work. And that was supposed to seal the border, and we know, unfortunately, it became a failure. Why? Because in the 1990s, it became very easy to create a fake document. And those of you who have done I-9 work, when somebody hands you a document, a fake document, you don't know. I don't know. They all look real. And so the paper I-9 verification system was a failure. E-Verify has been a pilot program by Congress. And the comprehensive immigration bill that we thought was going to pass in 2014, it was
The Gang of Eight.
the Gang of Eight was too much for Congress to swallow. And so it raises the question, what sort of incremental legislation could we get to just
move incrementally because Congress does not seem to have any appetite for anything comprehensive.
So for instance, on incrementally, here's a question. What prevents the administration from hiring more people to just expedite asylum seekers?
So when you have 1.8 million cases that are backlogged in the immigration court, the idea that you can hire a sufficient number of immigration judges to handle this in a way that's going to have an actionable result within a foreseeable time period simply isn't the case. In fact, the Biden administration has just put a new effort in, an effort to take away the adjudication function from the immigration courts, have it done by officers on the field. But that then runs into a problem because there have to be appeals from those provisions. But yeah, so for most of the time that I was in government, we had about 1,200 federal judges and under 200 immigration judges. And then we wonder why the backlog built up to the point where we now have, as I said, 1.8 million cases backlog, 650,000 plus cases of asylum that are backlogged. So this is not about manning or womaning up the bench to handle the problem. We need a reform of the system.
So with respect to that, and turning to the screen, and one of the questions has been, is, as we've anticipated, let's get an update, and where are we with DACA for all three of you, please?
Well, let me just, I was actually present at the creation of DACA when Secretary Napolitano issued the memorandum in 2012, 2013. And then I'm proud to be with a law firm that actually defended it pro bono and won the case in front of the Supreme Court to keep it going. But it's always been a temporary program. And unfortunately, today it remains a temporary program. 75% of the American people think the world of these dreamers. And for good reason. These are young people who have known no other country. They've been educated in our schools. They work in our professions and in our occupations. They've been in the military. And they're extraordinary young people for the most part. 650,000 people who live in limbo because of the paralysis that we've talked about with respect to Congress. But on this one, we really, all of us, regardless of our political, where we are politically, the 3 out of 4 Americans who completely support this program need to actually be heard. Because as a result of the recent decision, Greg can talk about with more precision, a decision this week, the DACA program was declared illegal and unconstitutional by a district court, and the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals in New Orleans upheld that. Now, let me turn it over to Louis, to Greg to talk about what's happening. But the point is that even now, that's going to be a temporary status for some very extraordinary young people.
I think we're all dizzy from the ping pong ball going back and forth. The Trump administration tried to dismantle DACA, and the Supreme Court said there was a reliance interest after 10 years. You can't just dismantle. You need to do formal notice of rulemaking and comment. And so then that got remanded. And then the district court in Texas said, well, the Obama administration exceeded their authority. And then last night, the Fifth Circuit agreed with that. And they remanded it and said, well, Secretary Mayorkas recently did formal notice of rulemaking, because that's what you said they should do. And so now it's been remanded to see whether or not, even in spite of rulemaking, does that exceed the authority from the congressional statute? So this thing is probably going to go up to the Supreme Court, and it seems like every court is bending over backwards to signal to Congress, please do something, because we can't, in good faith, based on the statute, honor this program.
Whenever the United States has faced sort of a surge in people it can't figure out, it's created legalization programs. We saw the first one of these in the 1920s when women lost their citizenship because of marriage to a foreign national male. U.S.-born women are suddenly not citizens because they're married. We faced it during World War II. We have a program on the books called Registry. And this just basically says, if you can prove you've been resident since a certain date, and the date keeps getting updated, it began in the 1920s, the current date is 1972, that was in FERPA, the 1986 Act that we talked about, you have a presumption of legality. You have likely proved some things, but very low bar. We haven't updated the registry date since 1986. DACA is important, but so are the 8 million, 9 million family members of those DACA recipients, some of whom are just younger, equally striving young adults who have only known the United States, who haven't been able to apply since the Trump administration. They haven't been able to get into the front door to DACA. So where I think we should be putting all of our efforts, the 75% at least of us that agree that DACA contributes to the United States, into protecting those 650,000 or so folks who currently have DACA, we should think about a broader reform, updating the registry date. Again, in '86, it was updated to 1972, so if we subtract 14 from, doing this in my head, 2008, anyone that's been resident since 2008 is the presumption of legal residence in the United States. Obviously, having to prove they haven't been content, the usual sort of bars that we established. That would take care of so much of DACA, even their parents, in a very positive way for the country, because we, the panel, disagree a little bit on the number, but I think we all accept that the majority of undocumented immigrants in the United States have resided in the United States for at least 10 years and probably 15 years.
The problem with that, Louis, is that you remind me, it's a very creative idea, but it reminds me of Dwight Eisenhower. President Eisenhower once said, when you can't solve the problem, make it bigger.
This registry, I think, shows how immigration has changed. The congressional debate over immigration has changed in the United States. In the old days, half of Congress didn't care about immigration. They didn't like immigrants, they might, whatever. But they didn't have immigrants in their districts. So in the deep, dark recesses of night, they could agree on updating the registry date. Which is what they did for many years. Now, probably every member of Congress has immigrants in his or her district and is strongly pro or strongly against. So I absolutely agree it will work, but I'm just saying, let's not lose the 10 or so million other undocumented immigrants from 650,000 DACA recipients who are, if not equally deserving, very close to being.
Where we disagree there is that people, look, all of us know, or should know, undocumented migrants, some extraordinary people, but the fact is that they did enter the country in illegal fashion, and that is something that the American people are not going to look aside unless we have an amnesty that Greg talked about. But that's the tragedy, is that we have so many constructed people, but on the DACA, the reason I drew a distinction with DACA is there is no question but that these were young people who were brought into this country with no choice on their part. They made no decision offensive to the United States or its law, and we so I wouldn't bundle them with a much larger group of, in many cases, quite extraordinary people themselves.
So here's a question that maybe is a little bit of a fishing statement, this little topic from Craig. So after someone comes across the border and is processed, how many forget, quote unquote, to come back for their hearings?
Well,
And so that's the paranoia I think that a lot of people.
yeah, but put on the immigration court. We said there's a slide on the immigration court. statistics, right there. The one that shows the difference in that, the Executive Office for Immigration Review. These are the adjudication statistics. Now remember, most of the enforcement activities conducted by the Department of Homeland Security, Customs and Border Protection, and ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement. The EOIR, which is the office that processes migration cases, is in the Department of Justice. So first you have this big bureaucratic divide. But if you look at let me see if I can, because this really makes the point of what's going on. Those two arrows, the key arrows, let me go over there. The two key arrows are, this is the denial rate, and this is other rate. So what you see is about 80% of the cases are either denied, together, a combination of denied or others. The reason you've seen this come down and this rate go up is this is when migrants realized that these are people acting rationally in response to the situation. They said 3 out of 4 people who actually get to the immigration courts are being rejected by the courts for asylum. So why should we show up? And because there's very little interior enforcement, that is people being snatched out of their home, off the streets, people say, I'm just going to abandon the asylum petition. That's why you see the other rate go up here and the denial rate go down, but the grant rate has been pretty standard at about 25% of the cases.
Right? And this creates a horrible vicious cycle, right? Because, on the one hand, we have this humanitarian crisis, and as human beings, we want to treat people with dignity. On the other hand, there's certain members of the House that say, well, look, you're just making the problem worse. And so we don't get to communicate, negotiate, and compromise. And just to dovetail on that, the word path to citizenship is very noble, but it is a non-starter for many members of the House. And so sometimes I feel like with immigration discussions on the Hill, they're talking completely different languages, and there's no interpreter or translator. And one side is saying path to citizenship, and the other side is saying do something about the border. If you could, Rick, I think it's the second to last slide or something where we talk about Congress again. The one before, where is Congress? Effective policy press? Yeah. Going back to 1986, that comprehensive bill passed, right? But it legalized 3 million, but then we found out that the I-9 process was a failure. And so I think a certain segment of the American population feels maybe that they were cheated. And so what's the solution? We do have some technology with E-Verify. And so if I provide my US passport to an employer, they can check, is it me, and my name and my social, and I think a lot of members of the House could go for something like that. A phased-in mandatory E-Verify over a 5-year period for new hires and existing employees, and that along with the transnational migration management. Now I think you're talking the language to a lot of members of the Hill that then they could start to maybe think about DACA and about legalizing 11 million and all sorts of other humane things. But until we talk about mandatory E-Verify and migration management, I don't think we're going to ever be able to talk in the same room with the same language.
So I think we all believe that we need a system, right? Everyone's crying out for a system. One of the great questions here is pretty simple. How do we actually force Congress to act? I know you've all got opinions on
Everybody,
that.
the problem in our country, ladies and gentlemen, is that everybody hates Congress but loves its member of Congress. We can't get Congress back institutionally, but we don't throw out the bums in our own districts. So,
And we're increasingly drawing districts where the only way you can throw them out is with something more extreme. So it makes it a little bit harder. But, you know, we've been critical of California here. Let us credit California for its independent redistricting movement, which has done, looking at the composition of the state, a pretty good job of creating competitive districts. I think we have more in percentage terms this time than we've had, well, in my lifetime.
Can I talk about one of those bullet points there?
Yes, please.
So, you know, it's interesting, Lewis talked about the 1965 Act, and as part of that act, Congress had created a schedule of what they said were, they authorized the Department of Labor to create a list of shortage occupations. And Schedule A had doctors and nurses and physical therapists, and then there was a Schedule B for elevator operators and dishwashers and car wash employees. And then the Department of Labor got rid of it 20 years ago or so, at least on the unskilled labor. And so one thought that we've been talking about is creating a regime for shortage occupations where state governors could designate in their own state shortage occupations. So the state of Texas could decide what occupations they have a shortage of. State of New York could decide theirs, and then that would allow those employers to file petitions with guest workers. And hopefully something like that could get some traction at some point.
You know, the problem's only going to get worse. We've got, you know, failing states. There's a couple questions here about, you know, climate change, regimes that are oppressive, with all the reasons we know. So the problem will really only likely get worse. In sort of closing here, just some predictions about what we're going to see maybe in the next, and we didn't talk about this question, but I'm going to ask you to predict over the next 10 years what we're going to see at the southern border, and maybe address the question we did talk about was, you know, does a fence actually work?
Well, a fence does not work. It's a great public works project. It does a lot of environmental damage in the process. There are parts of far west Texas where you couldn't build a fence even if you wanted to. There's a 200-foot sheer drop to the, anyway, it's just a bad idea. The fence that exists now, thanks to President Trump, is ever so marginally bigger than the fence that was already there thanks to Presidents Bush and Obama. So there was fencing where fencing helped and other things where other things helped. Looking forward to 10 years, I mean, I don't see sort of Congress stepping up to the plate. And that's where the responsibility lies under the Constitution. And that's unfortunate because the problems remain. The nation is short of labor in multiple parts of the economy. That will go up some years and down other years, but the principle is always there. We also have families that reasonably expected to be able to live together with, you know, their children, their parents, and, you know, maybe even more distant relatives that we don't think of as being part of the family in the United States. That's going to create a continued pressure on migration. And then everything that Rick identified, you know, failed states, climate change, putting pressure on migration. I don't think we're just going to feel it on the southern border. The pressure is going to be in the interior because half of permanent undocumented migrants came in under legal short-term visas, one sort or another, and overstayed their visas. And that's going to continue to grow. We don't have an enforcement regime anywhere near as richly developed in the interior as we do at the border, where it's obviously not terribly effective.
Great, we'll finish with
Well, this will just be a lead into Alan has this fascinating article about migration management and creative ways to go south of the border to negotiate solutions and so on. So I'll let you fill in the details.
So actually, as I said before, I don't think we have a border security problem. I really don't think the border is out of control. You have people lining up to find U.S. law enforcement officers. We have a system that does not work because it's broken. But I also wouldn't want to be pessimistic to the extent that one of the shortcomings that we have as human beings is we tend to project the current situation inevitably into the future. There will be many things that take place that we cannot now predict. But we'll start to see signs of whether or not we can emerge from this, avoid going back to a Trump approach to migration and then swing to a Biden approach. The system can't handle the pendulum swinging that quickly. Think about the pressure it puts on career civil servants, let alone on migrants and migrant families. But we're going to start to see signs of what will happen. For example, the midterm, now a month from now, we're actually going to see whether or not migration, which has been the key determining factor in virtually every midterm election since Clinton, we're going to see whether or not that will continue to lead to a big swing against the current administration. But the big unknown this time is the abortion ruling of the Supreme Court as to which is going to have more of an impact on the midterm election. So, I think we're predicting, certainly make predictions. I prefer talking about what we ought to be doing, which is take care of what we can take care of in incremental form. We need high-skilled workers. We can't be throwing out the university graduates that have traditionally come to this country from abroad. We've got to keep them as we have. They help build the leadership position of this country in virtually every area of expertise in every sector. We need to fix DACA. This is something that the American people want. But we also need to fix the asylum system. And to do that, I understand where the question was coming. You said hire up judges, but I think we understand why that won't work. What we need to do is actually let people apply for asylum in their home countries. See, we have to offshore, and right now, the standards for asylum and refugees are actually the same standard. But refugees are all done outside of the country. They apply, they're vetted, and we need to do the same with asylum. Because what we're essentially doing now, ladies and gentlemen, frankly breaks my heart as not such a tough cop. We insist that migrants put themselves into the hands of smugglers who today are abusing them at rates we have never seen before. And we do that because that's the only way they can get to the border to stand in those lines and claim asylum. If we had a mechanism for asylees to be in their home countries and to apply, by offshoring this process, we should do that. Most of what we do wrong at the borderline shouldn't be tried at the borderline. We have to look at flows of migrants coming toward the borderline and enlist time and space to work on these problems as far away from the borderline geographically as we can do, and as early in time before people would arrive at the borderline. That's the kind of system that we could implement.
Could we get a bill to pay for that?
Yeah, we're paying a lot more for doing it the way we're doing it now broken system than what we could do if we actually designed something that would accomplish and eliminate the use of smugglers, which are now actually, this has gotten so lucrative. When I started, when I pictured San Diego in 1994, it cost about $1,500 or $2,000 to get smuggled across the border. These migrants are getting required to pay $10,000 or $15,000 or more now. The money is coming largely from undocumented people in this country to pay for the movement of their relatives and children. And the whole system is upside down.
Hold on, 3 seconds. Credit some of our allies that are, Mexico has really stepped up in terms of absorbing some of the northern triangle migrants, and the Andean countries are absorbing some of them as well. Not huge numbers, but nevertheless, we should credit our allies for seeing this as a regional problem and not just a U.S. problem.
You know, we've got a ton of great questions here, but it's also 8:15 and we've run over. I'm sure we can talk about this for a lot longer, but please join me again in thanking Ray. And for a quick token of appreciation, over there. We just have a small gift for each of you. So this is the clear orange, not the golden orange, but the clear orange. Again, wanted to thank you very much for being with us this evening.
Thank you very much, Rick. What a great panel. Thank you all. Very interesting discussion. Great job moderating. Thank you all for being here tonight. I would like to just take a couple of moments. I mentioned earlier we have a new staffer, Krista Seitz. Would you please join me in welcoming her to our Virtual Affairs Council staff? Thanks very much. Couple of points. We're starting a strategic planning process. And about where is this organization going? How are we going to get there with what? And it would be great to have your input and your participation. There'll be an email out to the membership inviting you to start to participate. We'd love to have all the input you care to offer and your thoughts. So I also want to thank our corporate members here, R&D Medical Products, also Roman Ventures, and Tomas and Associates. So thank you all for being here tonight. And sorry we couldn't get to all the questions, but the questions that were handled were done very well. I thank you again. Please join me one more time for our great panel here tonight. And thank you all. Have a wonderful evening. Thank